They ripped the tie from his neck like it was stolen, called his shoes a costume, and dragged him across marble floors, as if he were dirt tracked in from the street. In a room built for wealth and whiteness, he stood as the only black man, and they made sure he knew it. No questions, no verification, just hands on him, mouth smirking, and whispers slicing through the air like knives. They didn't care who he was. They decided what he wasn't. Not one of them. Not worthy. Not welcome. They told him to leave before they called the police, assuming that someone with his skin had no right to stand where legacy usually walks. But what they didn't know, what none of them saw, was that they had just humiliated the wrong man. The kind of man who doesn't speak loudly, because power doesn't have to. And while they smiled, while they laughed, while they dismissed and degraded him, he was already deciding what pieces of their world would fall first. This isn't just a story. It's a warning, a reckoning. And when the twist comes, you won't see it coming, just like they didn't. If this kind of truth hits you, hit subscribe. Leave a comment. Where are you watching from? And how would you have reacted in that room? Let's talk. Roland Deeks entered the Everstead National Flagship Branch with the quiet assurance of a man who understood both money and silence. His slate gray suit fit him with precision, the crisp fabric barely shifting as he moved through the revolving glass doors and into a space carved for the elite. The lobby exuded wealth not with gaudy ornamentation, but with understatement. Glass so clear it disappeared. Marble floors soft-lit by gold sconces, the low hum of strings drifting from hidden speakers above. It was a space engineered to intimidate, to quiet, to remind. And he did not flinch. He belonged here, or so he thought. Just steps past the reception desk, he approached the private client counter, where a woman with meticulously styled hair and pearl earrings sat poised behind a sleek computer monitor. She raised her head when she saw him, her polite smile faltering for just a breath of a second, replaced by something tighter. Her eyes swept over his appearance, the deep brown of his skin, the tailored jacket, the briefcase in his left hand, and her voice stiffened as she greeted him. Before he could even give his name, she leaned forward slightly and asked if he was there to collect something on behalf of a client. Her tone was not rude, but it wasn't respectful either. It was clinical, dismissive, aimed at containing something she did not recognize. When he informed her of his appointment with the investment office, scheduled, confirmed, and logged, she blinked twice, asked him to wait, and excused herself to speak with someone behind a frosted door. Roland exhaled slowly, shifting his weight to his left foot, but even that subtle movement was misinterpreted. A security guard, tall and blocky, with a buzz cut and an accent that hinted at Eastern Europe, approached him from the edge of the lobby. The man's eyes narrowed as he stepped into Roland's space, his voice low and smooth like steel wrapped in velvet. "Sir, I need you to stand over here." Roland didn't move. He didn't argue. He simply asked why. The guard didn't offer a clear answer, only that he had received a call, that there had been confusion, that Roland should step aside until someone could verify his presence. A second guard appeared, this one younger, sharper in movement. The first one spoke into a lapel mic while the younger positioned himself slightly behind Roland, not touching, but close enough to suggest that any movement might be a mistake. At first, Roland thought it was an error, bureaucratic oversight, miscommunication. But then he noticed it, the glances. From the older man reading a financial magazine by the window. From the woman in pearls tapping her phone beside the concierge. From a receptionist who now peeked through the glass door like she wasn't quite ready to return. The weight of their gaze pressed against him, not with concern, but suspicion. He became suddenly aware of every crease in his trousers, every breath he took, the barely there scuff on the back heel of his shoe. They saw those things too, and they decided, not who he was, but what he wasn't. Not a client, not a partner, not a man with business in the executive suite. The younger guard tilted his head and muttered something into his mic. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. He didn't believe Roland belonged. He wasn't investigating, he was waiting. Waiting for an excuse. Waiting for a crack. Waiting to enforce something unspoken but deeply understood. Roland was being profiled. again. His jaw flexed. He remained still, but his breath had shortened, his chest rising just a little quicker with each inhale. After several minutes, a junior manager arrived. Pale-faced and nervous, she held a clipboard like a shield. She scanned it, fumbled with a tablet, and asked for Roland's name. He gave it clearly. She frowned, scrolled, then looked up. "I don't see you on this morning's walk-in list." Roland didn't flinch. "I'm not a walk-in. I have a 9 a.m. appointment with Senior Advisor Tilson." She blinked. Her fingers moved again, this time opening a second system. A pause. A flicker of recognition. Then discomfort. "Oh, I believe that's on the executive calendar. I don't have access to that." She turned to the guards and gave a soft nod that meant, "Don't let him go yet. We'll check upstairs." 15 minutes passed. 20. The guards remained close, as if Roland might bolt through the lobby at any second. One of them leaned in and muttered something about shoes needing shine before someone tried to walk into a place like this. The comment wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The venom was in the smile. Roland didn't reply. He didn't lift his eyes. But something inside him, something tightly locked, shifted. 30 minutes into what should have been a seamless entry into a professional meeting, he was still standing in a marble foyer under fluorescent lights, being assessed like contraband. He was not offered a seat, not offered water, not even acknowledged as someone who had followed protocol. Instead, he was treated like an error, a glitch, a nuisance. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, and retrieved a printout of the meeting confirmation, placed it gently on the counter near the junior manager, who had since returned. She looked at it, then looked back at him. Her voice trembled slightly when she said someone would be down shortly. She didn't offer an apology, not even a smile, just the confirmation that she had seen it, but not that it had changed anything. A man walked past, gray suit, gold watch, blue eyes that glanced sideways and lingered just a fraction too long. He turned to a colleague and whispered. Roland didn't catch the words. He didn't need to. He had heard them before, dozens of times, hundreds. He knew what they were wondering, what they were assuming. He stood still. Roland hadn't moved from his spot by the concierge desk when a third figure approached, this one moving with an air of slow authority. The floor manager, a man named Connors, dressed in a muted charcoal blazer and gold lapel pin, his expression carved in stone. He didn't address Roland directly at first, but leaned over the counter to speak quietly with the junior associate, who nodded quickly, clutching the printout Roland had handed over minutes earlier. Connors examined it with bored eyes, as though deciphering a nuisance rather than reading a professional document, then finally turned his gaze toward Roland, letting it settle with the studied disapproval of a man who'd already made up his mind. He gave a short chuckle, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and tapped 2 fingers against the page. "Fancy words," he muttered, shaking his head. "I see this kind of thing more and more lately. Somebody reads a Forbes article and thinks they understand wealth management." Roland met the man's eyes without blinking, but his jaw had tightened. He'd been talked down to before, at cocktail hours, at real estate closings, in boardrooms where he was the only one who looked like him. But this wasn't just condescension. This was a stage performance meant for the growing crowd of clients and staff nearby. Connors lifted the paper, waved it once as if it were counterfeit, then folded it in half and handed it back with a smirk. "We'll get someone to speak with you shortly, sir. Why don't you step back while we verify?" The second guard from earlier was already moving forward, his walk brisker now, and when Roland hesitated, more from restraint than resistance, the man placed a firm hand on his shoulder, guiding him backward, away from the concierge area, and directly into the center of the lobby. The motion was quick, but not subtle. Conversations around them paused. Heads turned. Clients in suits stopped mid-sentence to glance over their shoulders. A woman seated on a velvet bench set her espresso down and leaned forward. The message was clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a disturbance. Connors nodded at the guards as if giving permission. The younger of the two reached for Roland's briefcase, prompting a sharp inhale from him, And when Roland reflexively stepped to shield it, the guard pulled back, smirking. "We need to inspect your items." Standard procedure. Roland's voice, when it came, was quiet but razor-edged. "I'll wait for Tilson. You're violating your own protocol." The guard looked unimpressed. He gave a small shrug and said, "In that case, we'll wait together." His tone was casual, but the tension that had settled over the lobby was anything but. Another voice crackled from the guard's radio. "Copy. Move him now." The next moment happened fast. One hand on Roland's shoulder, the other reaching for his briefcase again. Roland didn't resist, but he did hold his ground, which seemed to irritate the older guard. Suddenly, the tie around Roland's neck was pulled loose, yanked down, and tossed to the polished floor like an unwanted napkin. The older guard sneered. "What kind of prop is this anyway?" Roland stood frozen for a beat, not from fear, but disbelief. He had entered the building 39 minutes ago for a scheduled financial consultation. Now he stood tieless, surrounded by two guards, and stared at the marble where his silk accessory had landed like a discarded illusion. Someone from the upper balcony level pulled out their phone. Another stepped into the hall, murmuring quietly into a headset. The air in the lobby had shifted, not just in temperature, but tone. It had become something darker, more primal. Theater wrapped in civility. Even the receptionist who first spoke to Roland no longer made eye contact. A tall, elderly man in a taupe coat passed behind the guards and muttered something under his breath about how standards were falling everywhere. A younger woman near the elevator said to her companion, "I thought he was a driver waiting on someone." The companion nodded, her eyes still fixed on Roland. Maybe he's pretending. Maybe he Googled banking words and thought he could fake his way in. Roland heard every word. He had trained himself for years to filter such things, to suppress reaction, to master the art of stillness under fire. But now, standing exposed in the center of the lobby with his tie on the floor and briefcase untouched beside him, he felt the heat rising in his chest like a silent alarm. He turned slowly to the younger guard. "Ask Tilson to come down here." The guard rolled his eyes. "Sir, I suggest you cooperate before this gets worse." Roland's hands remained still. "I have been. You're the ones improvising. That did it." The older guard stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His hand hovered over Roland's arm like a threat without contact. "You need to leave. Now. This is private property. You're disrupting clients." Roland's voice didn't rise, but it carried. "I am a client." The room shifted again. There was a flicker of motion from the mezzanine. A dark-suited man with an earpiece stepping toward the stairwell. One of the tellers leaned across her station, whispering urgently into a receiver. Still, Connors hadn't moved. He stood at the edge of the concierge desk, arms folded, watching like a judge. His eyes said everything. He didn't see a man. He saw a stain that needed to be scrubbed. The security team moved in again, this time with a new tone. One guard took a firmer hold of Roland's elbow. The other reached toward the briefcase with gloved hands. "Sir, if you don't exit the building, we'll have no choice but to involve authorities." Roland allowed the guard's grip without flinching, his spine locked straight. His eyes scanned the room, memorizing faces. The smirks, the murmurs, the satisfaction. They didn't care what he said. They cared only about how it looked. A well-dressed black man in the wrong place, in the wrong company, and now a spectacle. As they turned him toward the main doors, someone whispered too loudly near the lounge. He probably forged his appointment. He probably knew someone and tried to pull strings. Another voice added, or he just came in here to scare people into letting him talk to a manager. The guard said nothing. Connors gave a slow nod, as if a performance had concluded exactly as scripted. The elevator chimed softly in the background, but no one looked toward it. Everyone was watching the exit. Everyone wanted the show to end. Roland didn't speak again. His tie remained on the marble floor. His briefcase, unopened, was finally picked up and shoved into his chest by the younger guard. A final insult. "You forgot your paperwork, boss." The glass doors hissed open. The morning sun hit hard, too bright, too exposed. Roland stepped outside, his face unreadable. Behind him, the vault-like lobby resumed its curated rhythm. But it wouldn't last. The fuse had been lit, and the institution had just made a mistake it could never take back. The heavy glass doors closed behind Roland with a hiss, separating him from the cold indifference of the bank's lobby, but not from a sting of what had just unfolded. He stood for a moment on the steps, the sun washing over his face, chest still heaving in silent restraint. Behind those glass panes, clients returned to their conversations. Security guards repositioned themselves near the concierge desk, and the woman who had dismissed him without ever truly seeing him resumed her work with a faint smile. But not all had moved on. Two elderly clients, seated by the front window, watched Roland through the glass. One of them, a man with thick silver hair and a red silk tie, leaned slightly toward his wife, muttering beneath his breath while his eyes remained locked on Roland's still silhouette. She chuckled softly and whispered something back, and the man replied with a shake of his head, "I swear, they'll let anyone in these days. You'd think a place like this would know better." They both nodded in agreement, the judgment between them sharper than the sunlight that glared through the polished windows. Inside, Connors had returned to his station, but his expression had shifted. There was a trace of satisfaction in the arch of his brow, the way he slowly tapped a pen against the edge of his clipboard. Behind him, a junior teller leaned toward a colleague and whispered loud enough to be heard. "Did you see that scar above his left eye? He looked like one of those guys who hotwire cars in movies." The two of them giggled, and the younger one added, "Definitely not someone managing wealth. Maybe trying to scam his way into someone else's portfolio." She laughed again, then returned to her terminal, as if what she had said was simply harmless banter. Another employee, a tall man with square-framed glasses and a carefully styled beard, made his way toward the back office while talking on a headset. He paused by the lounge where two other staff were rearranging brochures and muttered, "That was the third one this month. They show up in suits, try to name-drop someone in investments, and hope nobody asks for credentials." A security officer passed by and replied, "Well, this one didn't even get loud." That's how you know he rehearsed it. Probably scouted the place first. A woman near the elevators glanced at them and asked, "Are you talking about that guy in the gray suit? I thought he looked familiar. Maybe he's one of those protest types, the ones that film themselves and try to get kicked out." Her tone was casual, but laced with suspicion. She didn't recognize Roland. She hadn't seen him before. But she didn't need to. His presence was an anomaly, and anomalies required explanation. Not one rooted in facts or credentials, but in bias and shared assumptions. Outside, Roland finally descended the stairs and stepped to the curb, his briefcase tight in his grip. He didn't check his phone, didn't pace, didn't leave. He simply stood, facing the building he had just been ejected from, as if willing it to acknowledge him. He wasn't sure why he hadn't walked away yet. Maybe it was disbelief. Maybe it was something deeper. Maybe it was the taste of humiliation still fresh on his tongue. A black SUV pulled up beside the entrance. A doorman immediately opened the rear passenger door for a middle-aged man in a navy suit, who stepped out and adjusted his Rolex with casual elegance. As he passed Roland, he glanced sideways and slowed for just a second. Then, with a condescending nod, he muttered, "You waiting on someone, champ?" Roland didn't respond. The man didn't expect him to. He was already halfway up the steps, entering a building that had just declared Roland unworthy of entry. A valet across the street noticed the exchange and shook his head slowly. He turned to a coworker and muttered, "That guy again. I've seen him before. Keeps showing up dressed like he belongs. Maybe he used to clean for someone rich." His friend laughed and said, "Or maybe he stole the briefcase." Probably empty. Roland remained motionless. But inside, something had cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough. Enough to bend the air around him. Enough to twist the silence into something heavy and alive. And then it happened. A black town car turned the corner and rolled to a stop beside him. The driver, a young white man in a suit, stepped out and circled to the sidewalk. He nodded politely, opened the rear door, and said calmly, "Mr. Deeks, we've been waiting for you upstairs." Roland blinked once, slowly. The driver continued. Mr. Tilson sends his apologies. There was a clerical delay. He asks that you come now. Please. Roland didn't speak. He looked once toward the doors, then back to the car. He adjusted the briefcase in his hand and stepped toward the open vehicle. Inside, the interior was immaculate. Cooled leather, fresh linen scent, and a folder already resting on the seat with his name printed on the cover. As the car rolled forward toward the rear entrance, the people inside the bank would not know he was returning. Not yet. They would not see him walk past the velvet security ropes, guided through executive corridors. The moment Roland stepped back inside through the executive garage entrance, escorted silently by the driver in the black suit, the air felt colder than it had been just minutes earlier. It wasn't the temperature. It was a shift in space, the weight of unseen expectations now compressing his every breath. They entered a service corridor lined with locked doors and security keypads, far removed from the vaulted ceiling and chandeliered opulence of the public lobby. Here, there were no curious stares, no whispers from pearl-wearing clients, no judgmental glances cast through tinted spectacles. It was quiet, too quiet. As they approached a black panel double door, the driver nodded once to a retinal scanner. The green light blinked. The door opened. Roland followed him inside. The room was sterile and modern, furnished only with a long tempered glass table, several leather chairs, and a monitor mounted on the wall displaying a digital clock, counting forward second by second. The folder with Roland's name sat at the head of the table, unopened. Mr. Tilson will join you momentarily, the driver said before stepping out and closing the door softly behind him. Alone now, Roland didn't sit. He stood with both palms pressed flat against the edge of the table, letting his mind quiet itself. He didn't care about the furnishings, the viewless walls, or the bland lighting overhead. His focus narrowed to the rhythm of the clock and the rising pressure in his chest that pulsed with each second lost to silence. And then the interruption returned. Not through the door, but from behind, another entrance, hidden, designed for discretion. Through it stepped the branch manager, Elias Harmon, a man in his early 50s with snow-white hair slicked flat against a freckled scalp, wearing a navy suit cut with razor precision and an expression carved from stone. He carried no folder, no apology, no interest in pleasantries. He moved as if each step was deliberate performance, calibrated for optics more than purpose. When his eyes met Roland's, there was no greeting, just a faint smirk curled at the edges of his lips, subtle but unmistakable. Elias didn't offer a handshake. He simply glanced at the folder on the table and said, "So you're the one causing all the excitement." The air in the room changed again, turning brittle. Roland remained still. He did not respond. Elias continued, his voice measured, every syllable dripping with practiced authority. "I've heard reports of some confusion downstairs. Security thought they had an impersonator trying to gain access to our investment department. We get that sometimes." Roland's stare didn't waver. His jaw tensed. Elias approached slowly, now standing across the table. His gaze flicked toward Roland's jacket, then dropped to his shoes, then rose again, and when it did, his smirk had hardened into something colder. Elias leaned forward slightly and said, "If you were really who you claimed to be, wouldn't you have someone else come do this for you? Someone more polished?" His voice dipped low, intimate like a secret. "Someone a little less conspicuous." The word hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Roland felt it land with precision. He knew what the man meant. He didn't need it explained. He had lived this coded language all his life, those carefully chosen words meant to signal exclusion without direct accusation, to wrap racism in etiquette and smile while doing it. The implication wasn't just personal. It was calculated. You don't belong here. You're too loud, too visible, too dark for this space. Roland stepped back slightly, his shoulders squaring not in confrontation, but in self-preservation. His hands clenched behind him, knuckles widening, not from fear, but restraint. But Elias wasn't finished. He paced slowly now, circling to Roland's right, like a hawk surveying wounded prey. He said, "We've had incidents before. People slipping in using rented suits and borrowed credentials. It's remarkable how far performance can go. Sometimes they're even convincing for a moment. He stopped walking, then added softly, but the shoes always give away. He was now behind Roland, speaking into his shoulder. They scuff differently when you're not used to marble. There was a pause, a silence meant to provoke. Roland's breathing remained slow and even. He had learned this technique in rooms far more dangerous than this. Hold the line, let them underestimate you, give them rope. But the next words from Elias struck deeper. It's fascinating, really. This hunger to be seen, to be mistaken for someone important, to live for 5 minutes, as if the world finally noticed you. He moved to the side now, standing just within Roland's peripheral vision. You're not the first, and I assure you, you won't be the last. At that moment, a knock interrupted the scene. The main door opened. A younger associate, barely 30, stepped in holding a printed report in one hand and an iPad in the other. He paused when he saw Roland, hesitated, then walked straight to Elias. Quiet conversation, a passing of papers, a glance toward the folder bearing Roland's name. The associate leaned closer and whispered something. Elias's eyes narrowed. He took the report, scanned a page quickly, then stopped. He looked up at Roland again. This time, his expression faltered, just slightly. He said nothing, but the subtle shift in his gaze, the delay in his breath, betrayed the realization that had just pierced through his preconceptions. He handed the page back to the associate without a word. The young man looked unsure whether to speak, but when Elias nodded, he turned and exited the room. Silence fell again. Elias now stood across the table, both hands braced on its edge. His eyes found Roland's, but the confidence behind them had cracked. The tension that had begun as a slow, silent pulse inside the executive suite now leaked outward into the broader corridors of the bank, trickling like a current through conversations, glances, and whispered judgments. Roland followed Elias Harmon through a secured hallway that led from the private conference room to the elevator reserved exclusively for upper-floor financial operations. The polished chrome doors reflected back 2 distinct images. One man trying to maintain composure after being unmasked as a fool, the other maintaining silence not from submission, but from the deep, deliberate patience of someone who had survived far worse humiliations. As the elevator doors closed behind them, neither spoke. The silence between them was filled with the echo of every word Elias had said just minutes before, words wrapped in professional civility, but soaked in venom. When the elevator opened on the 22nd floor, they stepped into an executive atrium, all glass and oak, with deep blue carpeting and recessed lighting that made the entire space feel like a luxury hotel disguised as a financial think tank. Staff bustled behind clear-walled offices, holding tablets and murmuring updates to one another. But as soon as Roland and Elias crossed the threshold, a noticeable shift occurred. Conversations faded to whispers. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. A young female analyst near the coffee station lowered her voice as she leaned toward a colleague. She nodded discreetly toward Roland and whispered, "He doesn't look like he belongs here." The other analyst, a man with soft features and a designer watch, responded, "Probably one of those guys who fakes investment credentials. You can tell by the outfit. It's trying too hard." The first woman frowned slightly. Or worse, identity theft. Could be someone who got access through an online backdoor and is trying to cash out a retirement account. Her tone wasn't harsh, but surgical, speculative, a hypothesis offered in the same breath as stock projections. They both watched Roland walk by, as if waiting for him to slip. Just one wrong move, one sudden shift, one reason to justify their assumption. In the glass-walled corner suite overlooking the city skyline, Tilson, head of fiduciary strategy, stood beside a table where a series of binders lay open. As Roland entered, Tilson didn't greet him with warmth or welcome. He glanced at Elias, then at Roland, then turned back to the documents. His expression was controlled, unreadable. Elias cleared his throat. "This is Mr. Deeks. He's here regarding the Bartell Sovereign Fund." There was a pause before Tilson replied, "I see. The fund listed under the Delaware Protection account." that has been locked for 12 months under Tier 7 discretion. Roland stepped forward and responded with the first verbal strike of his own. Not anymore. As of this morning, I executed the clause that gives me controlling interest. That's what I'm here to finalize. The room froze, but only for a moment. Tilson, to his credit, didn't argue. He nodded once, signaled to his assistant, and began preparing the verification forms. Outside the office, the rumor mill had begun to reach full speed. In the executive lounge, 3 mid-level managers reviewed the client roster while keeping one eye on the hallway. One of them whispered, "Did you see security walk him in? That's not standard. You don't escort real clients like that unless there's a situation." Another replied, "I heard he tried to force his way into the private meeting areas downstairs. Said he had an appointment, but no one could find it." Third added, "I bet he's some activist with a camera crew waiting outside. You watch, this will be all over the news in a week, us being portrayed like villains. Better hope compliance has our backs." Meanwhile, downstairs in the main branch lobby, the concierge desk received a request from a longtime platinum tier client named Gregory Kess. In his late 60s and always dressed in tailored 3-piece suits, Kess was known for donating generously to political candidates and rarely tolerating disruptions in his routine. Today was no exception. He leaned over the counter and gestured discreetly toward the now vacant center of the lobby where Roland had stood earlier, then said to the attendant in a clipped, practiced whisper, "I'm concerned about the clientele we're starting to attract. You might consider locking down the VIP zone unless your team can control who walks in from the street." His voice was polished but sharp, an insult dressed as advice. The concierge smiled professionally but made no promises. Minutes later, the instruction was quietly passed to security. Increase presence near private entries. No exceptions for walk-ins until further notice. On the upper floors, the assistant brought Roland a leather-bound set of final authorization documents. As he flipped through the pages with practiced familiarity, Elias stood a few feet away, arms crossed, pretending not to watch, but failing. His posture had changed from dismissive to cautious, like a man realizing that the narrative he had crafted in his mind no longer held water. Tilson signed the compliance sheet, initialed the fund transfer memo, and handed the executive keycard across the table. "Congratulations, Mr. Deeks," he said carefully. "Your instructions regarding capital allocation will be executed today." Roland accepted the documents with a single nod. Not triumphant, not angry, just efficient. He returned the key card to his jacket and said, "Have legal forward the confirmation to my counsel, and send the standard audit package to the trustees." As he turned to leave, Elias opened his mouth as if to offer a final word. Roland paused, not for permission, not for approval, but to ensure the silence said what no apology ever could. As he exited the room, the assistant quickly followed to escort him back to the elevator. In the lounge, conversations halted again. Staff peered from behind glass, waiting for something. A misstep, a final confrontation. But Roland offered nothing. No performance. The assistant who had escorted him earlier stood silently in the corner, fidgeting with his tablet, uncertain whether to make small talk or disappear. When the doors opened with a muted chime, the marble floors of the lobby gleamed again, untouched by the drama that had unfolded hours earlier, as if the building itself had purged the memory. But the eyes that turned toward Roland now weren't blank. They were wary, curious, resentful. He stepped out first, followed closely by the assistant, who offered a polite nod to the concierge. The nod was not returned. Behind the desk, the same receptionist who had earlier dismissed him now stared with forced stillness, her face locked in an expression that tried to be neutral but failed. One of the security guards, the younger one with a smug grin, stepped forward as Roland passed. He didn't block him this time, but he didn't move aside either. Instead, he held up a palm as if stopping traffic and said, "Sir, do you mind if we finish our protocol from earlier?" Roland paused, turning slightly, his voice quiet. "I've already presented identification." The guard smirked and gestured toward Roland's shoes. "Just need you to remove your footwear, sir, for safety." He emphasized the last 2 words as if they were legal armor. The assistant blinked. "I'm sorry, but he's just left a private meeting on the executive floor. This is Mr. Deeks." The guard's eyes narrowed. "I don't care who he is. If there's no VIP tag visible, we have to follow the rules." Roland remained still. The lobby had stilled again. Conversations dropped to whispers. A woman seated on a velvet bench leaned forward, whispering something into her husband's ear. He frowned and muttered, "Maybe he's not who he says he is after all." One of the tellers craned her neck to watch, lips parted slightly, as if waiting for something to break. The receptionist didn't intervene. Neither did the older guard, who now stood a few feet behind his partner, arms folded, silent. Roland removed his shoes. Calmly, precisely. His hands did not tremble. His posture did not dip. He placed each shoe side by side on the floor, revealing socks with a faint, barely visible logo near the ankle, worn slightly thinned near the heel, not torn but aged, the kind of imperfection that catches the attention of those looking to diminish. The guard smirked again. Stylish on the outside, but the small things always give it away. He turned to the older guard and whispered, loud enough for the room to catch, "Bet you 20 this guy practiced walking like a banker." Roland said nothing. He waited as they patted down the interior of his blazer, checked the lining of his pockets, lifted the tongue of his shoes, and waved a small scanner over his waistline. Nothing beeped. Nothing triggered. But it wasn't about security. It was about control, performance, punishment without violence, humiliation wrapped in protocol. Behind the concierge desk, a new employee, young, still in training, watched the scene unfold and leaned toward her mentor. She whispered, "Why are they doing that, if he just came from upstairs?" Her mentor replied, "That's just the drill for unverified entrance. Probably got access through someone's assistant. They'll clean it up later." When the inspection ended, the guard stepped back without a word. The assistant hesitated before handing Roland his briefcase, suddenly too ashamed to meet his eyes. Roland picked up his shoes, slipped them on one at a time, adjusted his cuffs, and looked around. The people in the lobby did not meet his gaze. They looked away, down, into screens, at paperwork, anything but him. Except for one. A middle-aged man near the window, Gregory Kess, still watched, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in smug approval, as if to say knew it. As Roland turned toward the exit, the door opened for him automatically, triggered by a silent sensor, and he stepped back onto the sunlit steps without ceremony. But the moment he crossed that threshold, a new figure appeared. A young woman, mid-20s, well-dressed but anxious, hurried down the steps from a black SUV parked just to the side. She held a folder in her hands, face pale, eyes wide. "Mr. Deeks," she said breathlessly, "legal just confirmed the updated directives. Your authorization for executive restructuring has been registered." She looked past him at the lobby. "They didn't know, did they?" Roland replied with a quiet, bitter smile. "Not yet." She handed him the folder. "There's more. Mr. Delcroft wants to speak with you directly. The office is preparing a statement. They're going to want your signature on the revised compliance charter." She paused. "And sir, there's going to be fallout." Her words were laced with quiet anticipation, half fear, half awe. Roland didn't flinch. He took the folder, nodded once, and stepped into the SUV, waiting beside the curb. Behind him, the doors to Everstead National Hist closed again, once more shutting out the man they had just reduced, inspected, dismissed, still not realizing that with each layer of forced obedience they had imposed on him, they had only revealed more of themselves. The SUV pulled away, quiet and clean, disappearing into the midday traffic, and the bank returned to silence. Inside, the guards resumed their positions. As the SUV merged into the flow of downtown traffic, Roland sat in the back seat with the folder resting unopened beside him, his mind not on the papers, but on the weight of the last 2 hours, the coordinated degradation carried out in polished silence by the very people who would soon answer to him. The driver remained silent, focused, aware of the tension that filled the cabin like static before a storm. Roland reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a sleek, dark phone, the one with no apps, no browser, no traceable data. Just one encrypted function. He entered a 6-digit code and waited. The screen blinked once, then displayed a prompt. Activate executive protocol? His thumb hovered, then pressed yes. A second later, a voice on the line, clipped and composed, asked for final confirmation. Roland responded with 2 words, execute now. The call ended. Nothing around him changed. No sirens, no sudden movement. But across the city, and more importantly, within the fortified servers beneath Everstead National Bank, a silent chain reaction began. The primary transaction pipeline paused. System 14, handling high-tier trust distributions, flagged for override. Executive authorization tier adjusted. Secondary accounts shifted into locked reconciliation. At first, no one inside the bank noticed. Operations continued. Clients sipped espresso. Associates smiled at their screens. But 8 minutes later, the alarms began, not the loud ones, but the internal ones, the ones meant for those with access above director level. On the 22nd floor, Tilson's assistant received a flashing prompt on his screen. Urgent, sovereign trust reallocation alert. Access denied. Override in progress. Confused, he tapped again. Same result. He walked briskly to Tilson's office and handed him the tablet. Tilson stared for only a second before reaching for his landline. Down in the IT control hub beneath the lobby, 3 technicians stopped what they were doing as the system queued and suspended 6 live transfers over $10 million each. One of them muttered, "This doesn't make sense." Nothing was scheduled. Who signed off? The system flagged every query. Internal review pending. Security override. Tier 7. No name displayed. Just a string of hexadecimal code. At the same moment, Connors received a call on his personal line. He stepped into the hallway to take it. His face paled almost instantly. He responded with forced calm, then ended the call and turned toward the security staff. Clear conference suite 3. Now, contact executive council. Tell them to get down here. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. Upstairs, Elias Harmon opened his email to find a message with a single line. You are no longer authorized to act on behalf of Bartell Sovereign Holdings. Effective immediately. His cursor hovered, stunned, before the second message arrived. This one came from the General Office of the U.S. Federal Trust Compliance Division, confirming Roland Deeks as the active, verified executor of all accounts under the Bartell Global Fund structure. His hands went cold. He glanced toward Tilson's office, and then it clicked. Every word he had said earlier, every sneer, every insult. He didn't just target a man with power. He had tried to humiliate the man who now controlled the bank's largest liquidity partner. In the boardroom 2 floors below, a hastily summoned crisis meeting was already underway. The CFO, 2 regional directors, a legal consultant, and a compliance officer sat around a darkwood table, faces tense, laptops open, scanning the growing list of transaction freezes. One of them asked, "Who triggered this?" "Who is Deeks?" The CFO replied. His name came up on the restructure file from Geneva 3 weeks ago. I thought it was a clerical error. I didn't realize he'd assumed full control. Another added, "We've been trying to land the Bartell reallocation since Q2. If this pulls, our entire Tier 1 capital ratio collapses." Silence followed. Then the CFO asked, "Where is he now?" A pause. Legal said, "He left 15 minutes ago. But he's still in the city." A call was made. Then another. Messages sent. No responses. Roland's phone remained dark. No signal. No reception. No further access granted. In the SUV, Roland finally opened the folder. Inside was a slim contract. It was prepped, templated, and ready for signature. An addendum granting him authority to reassign capital as he saw fit. No board vote necessary. All it required was a timestamp. He pulled out a pen, signed his name, and placed it back into the leather sleeve. As the SUV made a turn and pulled up to a low-profile office tower, owned quietly by one of his shell companies, Roland stepped out and entered through the side door. Upstairs, a legal team had already assembled. His lead advisor stood at the head of the table. "Sir, we've received word from Everstead. Their legal is in damage control mode. They're preparing to issue a revised protocol to staff. They want to arrange a meeting. Roland sat. He didn't look at the papers. Instead, he spoke slowly, coldly. Inform them the Bartell Fund will be withdrawing 70% of allocated assets within 48 hours. We'll give them a chance to respond. The advisor paused. That could crater their investment here. Roland nodded. Good. Let them feel it. Meanwhile, back at Everstead, panic had spread. Word leaked quickly that something was happening. Something big. Analysts speculated. Account managers whispered. The IT department shut down non-essential access across all terminals. Tilson demanded to speak with someone from Roland's legal team. No answer. Elias retreated to his office and locked the door. Connors stood outside the elevator, watching the floor lights blink, as if waiting for someone to reappear and undo the storm now rolling through their marble halls. But no one came. No apology arrived. Just silence and uncertainty and a slow, dawning awareness that the man they had mocked, searched, insulted, stripped of dignity. He was the one holding the fuse. And it was burning fast. The morning sun had barely stretched across the skyline when the boardroom at Everstead National's corporate headquarters lit up in full emergency session. The scent of strong coffee and corporate fear hanging heavy in the air as the senior executives, some still in half-knotted ties, others in tense silence, waited for the man whose name now carried the weight of judgment. The boardroom, a long rectangular chamber lined with frosted glass and mahogany walls, was built for intimidation, not transparency. But on this morning, it trembled under the knowledge that its power had shifted. Around the 12-seat table, members whispered to one another in clipped phrases, scanning legal briefs and risk assessments that had been updated twice in the last hour as more systems failed to respond, more accounts froze, and more phone calls from institutional investors went unanswered. At the head of table sat an empty chair, surrounded by high-backed leather seats filled with men and women who had once believed themselves untouchable. Tilson, the executive vice president of investments, kept checking his phone, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked wired shut. Harmon, the branch manager who had previously patronized Roland with a smirk and veiled barbs, sat with his arms folded and his face pale, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Connors, the operations chief who had orchestrated the humiliating security delay, wiped sweat from his brow with a trembling hand and muttered to himself under his breath like someone rehearsing a line he'd soon be forced to explain. Then the door opened. No assistant announced him. No secretary let him in. Roland walked in alone, dressed in the same slate-gray suit that had once been labeled as trying too hard, his posture still, his expression unreadable. In his right hand was the leather folder from earlier, now bearing a brass Everstead seal affixed to its side. As he crossed the room, the only sound was the low squeak of leather shifting as board members instinctively straightened their spines. He stopped at the head of the table and looked around slowly, one face at a time, and in that brief silence, a hierarchy was destroyed. One of the directors, an older woman known for her sharp tongue and colder investments, opened her mouth to speak, but Roland raised a single hand and spoke first. This meeting is no longer advisory. Effective as of 7:04 a.m. this morning, I have assumed temporary chairmanship under Clause 13 of the Bartell Discretionary Control Agreement. For the duration of this crisis and any resulting investigations, all executive operations are subject to my oversight. The words struck the table like a hammer. No one interrupted. No one dared. Tilson leaned forward. His voice, when it came, was forced through clenched teeth. What exactly are you proposing? Roland placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were 2 pages, each bearing lists. The first contained 5 names, all familiar: Elias Harmon, Philip Connors, Rachel Blythe, Louis Denham, Marissa Doyle. Each name was paired with the words, recommendation for immediate termination. Roland spoke again calmly. These individuals were directly involved in misconduct, discriminatory practices, and actions detrimental to fiduciary integrity. Their continued employment constitutes a liability to client trust and public image. Tilson looked around the table as if seeking backup, but no one spoke. Roland turned the second page. This one held an agenda: mandatory retraining protocols, diversity and anti-bias certification audits, and the establishment of a third-party oversight committee with quarterly reports tied to executive compensation. There will be no lawsuits filed on my behalf, Roland said, his tone measured, no public statements. But let me be clear, Eversted's immunity from reputational collapse depends entirely on the immediate execution of these terms. You have 48 hours. A man at the far end of the table raised his hand. He was legal counsel, previously uninvolved, now drawn in by necessity. If I may ask, what happens if the board declines these terms? Roland's eyes didn't move. Then I'll begin proceedings to withdraw the entirety of the Bartel Fund's capital and recommend to our European partners that Eversted be flagged for restricted access pending legal review. He paused, then added, "The last time that happened, the institution it affected no longer exists." That silence was final. The chairman of the board, an aging man who had not spoken until now, nodded once, grimly. "Mr. Deeks, we understand. You'll have full cooperation." Roland gathered his folder. As he turned to leave, no one rose, but all eyes followed him. When the door shut behind him, the silence remained, not the silence of power, but the silence of consequence. Downstairs, HR received new directives within minutes. Termination packages were prepared. Legal compliance began vetting training firms. Internal communications were scrubbed, softened, approved. The narrative was being rewritten. Roland did not stay to oversee it. He walked through the lobby, this time uninterrupted, untouched. Even the guards who had once smirked at his shoes now looked away. The receptionist glanced up, froze, and dropped her gaze. Not one apology, not one word. But Roland didn't need them. He exited through the front this time, stepping into the mid-morning light as a black sedan rolled to a gentle stop at the curb. The door opened before he reached it. Inside, his advisor waited. "It's done," the man said. "The firings are confirmed. Press lines are holding for now." Roland nodded. "Prepare the public statement. We don't need noise, just precedent." The car pulled away. Behind them, the building that had once dismissed him now trembled under his silence. By the end of the week, the temperature inside Eversted National's main branch had dropped not in degrees, but in tone, a shift that permeated every corridor, office, and hallway like an unspoken warning. Gone were the casual smirks, the hushed side glances, the dismissive tones that had once governed the building's social order. In their place remained a brittle, uneasy quiet, one held in place by consequence. Within 48 hours of the emergency board session, the names listed on Roland's executive order were no longer attached to security badges. Elias Harmon, the once infallible branch manager with a voice like polished arrogance, received notice of immediate termination accompanied by a non-disclosure clause and forfeiture of executive severance. It wasn't delivered with ceremony, but by email, time-stamped and signed with corporate brevity. His access credentials were revoked within minutes. He had walked into the office that morning, still hoping to downplay the fallout, to spin the scandal into misunderstanding, maybe even offer a carefully constructed apology if pressed. But what met him instead was a silent elevator that didn't accept his code and a locked door behind which his office had already been stripped of personal items. Outside the building, things were worse. News of the incident, though never officially leaked, found its way into industry circles, and then into regional business bulletins. The headlines weren't loud, they were surgical. Executive ousted amid internal investigation. Sources close to Eversted confirm retaliatory dismissals after discrimination claim. The implication was clear enough. Elias's phone stopped ringing by the third day. Friends who once lunched with him every Thursday now delayed texts, postponed meetings. The country club board asked him not to attend the quarterly gathering. His wife, whose social circle relied heavily on his position, asked what had really happened. He offered her a version of the truth sanitized with corporate spin, but her silence afterward told him she already knew. She had read the comments. The ones from anonymous staff who mentioned how he had laughed at clients behind their backs, how he had used the phrase polished monkey during off hours, how he had said men like that should clean the brass, not sign on the dotted line. Their daughter, in her final year at prep school, heard classmates whisper about the father who'd been fired from the richest bank in the city for racism. Elias began spending more time in the basement, on long walks alone, avoiding grocery stores where his name might be recognized. But even there, he wasn't safe from himself. The mirror gave no comfort. The voice in his head, once so certain, now circled endlessly around one memory: Roland's face, calm, unreadable, unbroken. Meanwhile, Connors, who had once ordered Roland's removal under the guise of procedural security, found himself named in an internal complaint filed by the bank's own legal counsel. It cited excessive discretion, unprofessional behavior, and an incident involving the physical handling of a client without cause. Within days, a civil rights law firm announced its intent to file suit on behalf of an unnamed executive investor who had suffered unlawful physical treatment and emotional distress at the hands of private security. Though no names were listed, everyone at Everstead knew who it was. Connors' photo, taken years earlier at a gala, appeared in the leaked pre-trial documents. The claims were brutal and damning: unauthorized contact, racial profiling, physical humiliation. Retirement? Forfeited. The pension? Frozen pending investigation. His own attorney told him plainly, "If you don't settle, you'll lose everything." The payout requested wasn't public, but the number whispered inside Everstead's walls was 7 figures. He had once bragged about retiring to Florida with a boat and a house near the coast. Now he worried about legal fees. As for the younger guard, the one who laughed at Roland Socks and called him a dressed-up fraud, he was quietly removed from the rotation. No official firing, no public mention, just gone. Security firms subcontracted by Everstead were told to conduct full staff audits. Uniforms changed. Rotation schedules shifted. Wages dipped. Reputation damage costs filtered downward. The whisper network among lower-tier staff grew cautious. Even clerks began measuring their words. Nobody wanted to be next. Elsewhere, the training programs Roland had instituted began. Not optional, not ceremonial, mandatory. Led by outside consultants with backgrounds in human rights litigation. Every member of management was forced to complete a 30-hour course on unconscious bias and institutional prejudice. Some took it seriously. Others grumbled quietly. But all attended. Roland's name was never mentioned in the slides. It didn't have to be. His signature sat at the bottom of every rollout memo, every schedule, every follow-up form. Directors were required to submit written reflections after each session. One of them, anonymous, wrote, "It's not about the humiliation we caused. It's about the world we built that allowed us to believe it was acceptable." Everstead's quarterly report made only one line of reference to the upheaval. Executive restructuring occurred in Q4 to align leadership with evolving client and ethical standards. But everyone in the industry knew what it meant. Institutional clients began watching Everstead more closely. Competitors asked quiet questions. Some investors pulled small amounts, not out of fear, but out of principle. And still, Roland never gave a press statement, never tweeted, never sought a camera. The victory wasn't in headlines. It was in silence. It was in watching a system recoil from its own reflection. It was in knowing that when power spoke his name now, it did so carefully, with respect, with caution, and most importantly, with memory. The months that followed did not arrive with fanfare, but with a kind of quiet recalibration that only happens after a system has ruptured and begun to remember what it broke. Inside Everstead National, the walls still shimmered with their corporate polish, the marbles still gleamed beneath curated lights, and the scent of roasted espresso still drifted from the cafe near the concierge. But the atmosphere had shifted not because of policy alone, but because of presence. Roland's directives had already reshaped executive practice, but what lingered now was the cultural reckoning that refused to be buried beneath spreadsheets and performance reviews. For many of the former staff dismissed in the aftermath, silence had been their first refuge, but reflection soon followed, and with it, a series of choices that began to ripple outward from the epicenter of shame. Rachel Blythe, the receptionist, who had once mistaken Roland for a driver and offered him no seat, found herself working part-time at a community co-op in the South Loop, one funded quietly by a non-profit linked to the very fund Roland managed. She never mentioned his name to her coworkers, but when she found out the founder's identity, she sat alone for a long time, notebook in hand, and finally wrote a letter she never intended to send. In it, she said, "I used to think I was just following expectations. Now I realize I was upholding a lie about who deserves to be heard." She folded the paper neatly and placed it into a donation box labeled Future Stories, unsure if it would ever reach him, but needing to write it all the same. Philip Connors, the former head of operations who had overseen Roland's public humiliation, relocated to a modest apartment in a different part of the city. The lawsuit against him had been settled quietly, but left a scar on his record that barred him from rejoining the financial sector in any managerial capacity. For a while, he sank into bitterness, blaming policies, culture shifts, anything but himself, until one Sunday morning, standing in line at a food bank he had once only known from news headlines, he overheard a young boy explain to his mother that he wanted to become a lawyer, so he could protect people who got blamed for things they didn't do. Connors stared at the boy for a long time, and when he returned home, he opened a new browser tab and began researching racial bias in corporate environments, not to disprove it, but to understand it. 6 months later, he applied to volunteer at a local justice initiative, stating simply in his letter, "I'm not here to teach. I'm here to listen." The most surprising shift, however, came from Elias Harmon, the former branch manager, once so defined by his disdain and command of hierarchy, spent months in relative isolation, his wife having moved back to her sister's, his daughter having refused to return his calls. He avoided public events, declined interviews, and when approached by a journalist for a retrospective article, he responded with a firm request to leave him out of the narrative. But privately, something had been growing. Each night, he reread the termination memo, not for the words, but for the name at the top, Roland Deeks. He researched Roland's career, his investment background, his public records, but also his philanthropic work, his scholarship endowments, his community outreach programs. And then he picked up a pen. The letter began formally, but evolved into something raw, personal, even self-effacing. "I wanted to believe I was a gatekeeper," Elias wrote, "but the truth is I was a mirror for everything this industry tries to deny. I see that now, and I see what I cost myself and others." He sent the letter through Versted's general contact portal, with no expectation of reply. But he didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, Elias walked into a small community center in Bronzeville that had recently hosted one of Roland's foundation-supported events on economic literacy. He asked if they needed speakers, not to talk about finance, but about failure. At first, he was met with skepticism, but after several weeks of persistence, he was given 5 minutes at the end of a youth seminar. He told his story, not with flair, not with blame, but with truth. "I was taught how to win," he said, "but I was never taught how to see. And now I'm learning." The video of that speech, recorded by a teenager with no affiliation to any press outlet, eventually surfaced online, quietly titled "Man Admits He Was Wrong," and it reached Roland only when one of his interns forwarded it during a Friday briefing. Roland watched it without reaction, closed his laptop, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of the world no longer rested on proving anything. Change was not found in vengeance, but in motion. Across the city, across systems, the ripples continued. The bank adopted new onboarding structures, not just procedural but cultural, pairing incoming associates with mentors trained in equity frameworks. An anonymous fund donated resources to schools in underrepresented neighborhoods under the name RD Civic Equity Program. A few of the original staff, those who hadn't been dismissed, reached out to the foundation asking if they could volunteer. One of them, a teller who had once laughed behind a screen, now helped prepare financial literacy guides for first-generation college students. Roland's name rarely appeared on any of it. He refused interviews, declined panels, but when asked, those who had known the story, even in fragments, spoke with the same phrase. He didn't want a spotlight. He wanted change. And in that silence, something powerful had grown. Not fear, not fame, just a new foundation, one built on memory, on justice, on the understanding that sometimes, to heal a system, you don't just dismantle its lies, you invite its worst offenders to help rebuild the truth. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives that uncover truth, justice, and redemption in the most unexpected places. What part of Roland's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the public humiliation, the quiet revenge, or the unexpected redemption of those who once tore him down? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments, what did you feel while reading? And where in the world are you watching from? Your perspective matters. Let's talk about it.